Well, I'm going to try make this video brief. Uh, there's a tendency to kind of view social order as perhaps arising from some great congregation of either the state or maybe even pre-state of all society, and getting together and arriving at, for lack of a better term, some kind of social contract, and that an arrangement is made, and that law will come into existence, and property rights will come into existence, and the implication of taxation and all that. And although that's really convenient for us to think about it like that, in reality, it is very unlikely that the organization within society arose in that manner. In fact, I would go so far as to say it is practically certain that it did not arise in that manner. Typically, if we look at the law, generally there's a tendency to single out the first rulers that we have evidence that they did a lot in terms of law. Say Hammurabi is one that you hear a lot of, and attribute to them the creation of law, when even by their own claims, someone like Hammurabi was codifying a code of conduct, a law that predated his existence, his life. If we look at the idea of private property, it predates the state by a long time. In fact, fairly well-defined property rights are very likely to have existed with the advent of the NeoLithic revolution, which it depends who you ask, but we're talking maybe 10,000 years ago. You could argue that even earlier in the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic that there is evidence of private property, because some of the goods that we have, some of the artifacts that we find, it seems unlikely that they could have had uses to multiple different individuals at one time. They would have almost certainly been restricted to a given person at a given time. Although, how much can you really infer from such a limited amount of evidence? But with the Neolithic, for sure, when we start to get much more permanent settlements, and with agriculture, this becomes much more evident. And I know one of the best known sites that we have, which I've referenced before, is a place in Turkey. It's called Çatalhöyük. And when they say several thousand, I usually hear estimates 4,000 or 5,000 people live there at various times. And they're absolutely certain that there was no state. At least that's the consensus of everybody who's looked at it. And yet they have individualized dwellings that appear to have been private property. They weren't communal. They had exclusive control over each one. And if we look at the first states that we know about, say Naqada II in Egypt, or in Uruk in southern Iraq, are literally 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years after this period. And the question arises then, well, how exactly do property rights arise in this situation? And there's still, well, just because you didn't have a state doesn't mean that there wasn't a group. That's true. But I think that if you really analyze it, the best explanation is not that there was some kind of consensus created and agreed upon with any group at all, but rather all property rights, and I would argue all law, originates as a very long series of bilateral exchanges. Actually, a lot of market anarchists and economists will term the economy in this way, that if you break it down, everything the entire web of society is just a huge quantity of bilateral exchanges. I give money to the store, they give money to their vendors, I give money, so on and so forth. But I think that ideas like law and property, that also comes about through a series of bilateral exchanges, and I mean exchange in the sense of a mutual agreement or mutual understanding between two individuals. So at no point do I think, well, to illustrate, let's say that we're Natufians, who Natufians are cited, rightly or wrongly, as maybe the first real agricultural society. They were hunter-gatherers who lived in Syria, Iraq, and in the Middle East, and which is ununique. I mean, there are hunter-gatherers all over the world. What was unusual about them is that one of the crops that they ate were grains, wild grains like barley, wheat. That was part of their diet. It wasn't the only thing they ate. They were hunting and gathering as well, but they also started to gather these crops, and at some point there was a major ecological disaster, and basically the Middle East became like the Sahara Desert. And people who didn't want to die were forced by necessity to congregate in the few areas that could support life still, and these basically were the river valleys. This is almost identical to what happened in the Nile when the Sahara desertified a few thousand years later. And the Natufians basically seem to have, the culture that we call the Natufians, settled or became concentrated in basically the Jordan River Valley. And there isn't enough area in the Jordan River Valley to support a real large hunter-gatherer society, and so there became a very great need to derive more calories per unit of land than had previously been done. And basically farming was invented to create that. Now, the first farmers would have come into an area where there had been hunter-gatherers, and perhaps the hunter-gatherers had private property within their bands, but when you're a hunter-gatherer, the quantity of private property that you have, or not even, I shouldn't qualify that with private, just the amount of property that you have is pretty limited. It's basically everything you can carry and what you're willing to leave behind and not be too worried about somebody else stopping by and picking it up. And in that situation, you may have norms of ownership, but it's not as imperative as when you have a large amount of property and you have landed property, and where your life or death is really dependent upon that. And what would happen, this is my speculation, but I think it's a fairly reasonable one that's not refuted by the archaeology, I don't know that it could be proven from the archaeological record, is you'll have one person, let's just start with the example, one person goes and builds a farm, and at the initial phase of his settlement, there is no one else around him. Maybe there are hunter-gatherers who are still trying to make a living in the quickly desertifying other regions, but they're not looking at his land as something that they have any interest in at that point. And in this context, he has no real need of a definitive methodology for delineating ownership of land, because there is literally no competition. Anything that he tries to cultivate or he wants to consider his, there's nobody there to dispute it, and so it's a moot point. And this is the other thing. I think all law and all property is going to arise not only from a series of bilateral exchanges, but these exchanges are going to be instigated either by disputes or in anticipation of disputes. What will eventually happen, though, I mean, if the guy could live his entire life, and if he never has a neighbor, if he never has someone else who might conceivably make a claim on his property, there is no point in discussing property rights at all. But let's say more and more settlers approach the valley because things are becoming worse and worse, or the population is rising, and before you know it, others start to appear. And this is what I talked about in my previous video. The potential for conflict exists here. Other people need to survive. There's a limited number of resources. What do we do? Now, they could fight, obviously, and this, I'm sure, happens. It happens today. I'm sure it happened in the past. But it's not an automatic response, because fighting and violence carries its own dangers. The potential to die. And even if you're a strong person, even if you have good odds of defeating your likely opponents, it's still a risk. And if you make a habit of it, eventually you are likely to die or be injured. And so there is an incentive to maybe avoid that eventuality and to negotiate some kind of understanding. So he has his farm, and eventually, one day, somebody approaches and basically goes to land that he's not cultivating, but very close to it, and then starts to cultivate his own plot. And on the margins, there becomes a dispute. Now, the margin, he might, in his mind, have kind of considered the land he was farming, and maybe as far as the eye could see, as his property. Or he might have thought just the edge. It doesn't matter. As long as there's a disagreement, that's the point. And whether it's the other guy setting up a farm, you know, directly adjacent to his, or on top of his, or across the valley, if they have a dispute, they're going to either kill each other or fight each other, and maybe chase one off or chase the other one off, which is in the long run and on net not always going to be possible. These two are going to have to come to some kind of agreement, some kind of understanding, an exchange. This is where I say a bilateral exchange of ideas as to how they're going to survive without killing each other. And humans are very inventive, and they can actually, even in a situation where there's more people sharing fewer resources, find a way to cooperate. Not predicting that it will happen, but it could happen. And they might come to some conclusion that he says, okay, my land is exactly this because I started building it first, and so your land is, you can't cross this line. Or they may come to some other arrangement where they say, well, we'll farm the same plot of land, but we'll alternate days or seasons, or I don't know. They would have to work this out, and how they do it, there's no magic philosophy beforehand that we can invent that's going to tell us how they're going to decide. Whatever areas of agreement that they have is going to serve as a basis for them to come to some kind of understanding. And then let's say a season or two later, a third person approaches, and again, he will enter into, if they have a dispute. If they don't have a dispute, there's no point. If he builds his farm in a place that neither of the other two sees as something to worry about, then they will not have delineated or defined their property interactions, because as far as they're concerned, it's unnecessary. If, however, and more likely when eventually it comes to a point where another person enters the area and there's a dispute, they will enter into bilateral exchanges with each other. Say you got B in the middle. The first guy who came by was C. The new guy who comes is A, and he sets up shop on on the opposite side of B. And basically what happens is they all have an arrangement with each other, each individual with the other individual, and how exactly they arrange it might not be the same. I mean, the first two might have an arrangement where they swap days, but then the second guy comes and says, well, that doesn't work for me for whatever reason, and they come to an agreement that he will have his lot, but he's got to maybe share water rights or something. Who knows? It could be anything. And what will happen eventually is a very complex and increasingly standardized understanding of property rights is going to develop this way, just like in law. I mean, in law, what would happen is, say, a dispute arises. Usually, it's going to be a property crime. Somebody stole my pig. Somebody stole. Somebody. Here we don't like this term "stole," but somebody took a good that I viewed to be mine, and what are we going to do about it? And after a couple times of people having pigs stolen, it's very likely that the way that people resolve that dispute will become normalized. Like, okay, well, last time he took the pig, we made him give the pig back and a sheep. And the next time it happens, they might argue about it again, and they might come up with a slightly different answer, but eventually they'll probably start saying, hey, you steal a pig, you got to give back a pig and a goat. Pig and a goat. And each time is a sequence of a dispute, a bilateral exchange, and then maybe they'll resolve it themselves, or maybe they'll ask for an arbiter, in which case you've got two exchanges. Each of the plaintiffs have an exchange with the arbiter, whoever that is. That's assuming it's only one person and not several. You have a body of law that will develop, and you'll have a series of property norms develop. Now, what I don't like, though, is the imposition of, say, a third party enters the valley and just says, okay, you all owe half of your barley to me because I am the God King of the valley, of the city in the valley below, in the floodplain. And this is justifiable because you guys have property, you guys have a system of resource allocation, and by virtue of there being order and a functioning economy, basically, that you have all incurred a debt to a greater society, and I am here to collect that debt for that greater society. Basically, I'm here to tax you. Which I think this is an accurate, at least a very probable scenario for how this happened originally. Problem I have with this is that third party very likely took no part in the creation of the legal order or the property order. He just came in and asserted a right to it. The other problem is that, and this kind of comes back to the public debt, the people who have established these property rights, every time there's a dispute, it is resolved. And every time they make an exchange, it's a mutual one. Otherwise, there's a dispute, at which point they try and resolve it. Which is to say that you're not racking up some kind of amorphous debt to some other entity. You know, if you and I exchange, and then you and somebody else make an exchange, and then I exchange with that person, and every time we make an exchange, we're satisfied with the result. If a third party just appears and says, well, you owe me because you're making exchanges, that does not logically follow. That's a leap. That's kind of an excuse to basically steal. And so that's that. The other issue here is the group. I don't like this term of the group. There are questions we can have about what constitutes an individual, and it's a collection of cells, it's a group of cells, and there's determinism and free will, and what are the absolute ethical, metaphysical foundations for property rights. Those are all things that we can really discuss a lot, and there's uncertainty in them. Absolutely. Interesting questions we could ask. But with groups, there's not only more questions we could ask, but there's a great deal more certainty. And I've voiced this before, and I'm not going to go over all the reasons why groups are much harder to define. At the very least, with a farmer, he's a definite being. He has expectations, because he can say, I have expectations, and so we can wonder why he has them or where he got them, but at least we know he has them. With a group, we don't know that. Groups, a group may not even know. There's no evidence that groups have consciousness, let alone expectations. To look at the farmer, the farmer sows his crops because he thinks that the effort he puts into that, the result that he gets back is greater than the effort he puts in. He has an expectation of profit, basically. Some other third-party entity that only exists as a category doesn't have an expectation of reaping benefit from that. They don't even know he exists, very likely. And so for them to then make a claim on it, or what is really going to happen is an individual is going to make a claim on behalf of this greater entity, strikes me as that's a lesser claim. To whatever qualms we might have about an individual, we'd have greater qualms about some entity, so some group that we're anthropomorphizing and giving characteristics that it likely does not have. And so I would defer to the more concrete entity rather than the less definite one. I mean, because groups are not definite. They don't, as far as I can tell, they don't have a will. They don't definitely have definite existence, or their exact extent is not known. They don't have expectations, and they don't have property. I mean, if nobody in the state knows that you even exist, or knew that you even exist, what's their basis for saying that they own you? It's not. There isn't one, or your land. I think that the concept that theft or taxation and property are linked, and that one is theft, and if one is theft and the other one is, I don't see that, because the process through which property arises likely did arise and could at least arise, even if we were to say, oh, you're wrong, it happened another way. It could have happened that way. It can happen that way. You and I can run off into the middle of nowhere, and we can form an agreement with each other on how we're going to divvy things up, and some third party cannot come and legitimately claim to say, hey, the agreement that you reach between yourselves actually entitles me to X, Y, and Z. That doesn't make any sense. And that would be expropriation. The other thing here is the denying of a good. There's no equivalency here between denying the use of a good and taking one. If I expend my labor to create a product, and in so doing, you're not able to take that resource. So say I take a stick and I carve it into something. And my doing that means that you cannot take the stick, and so you steal the stick from me. I don't see the two as equivalent. In the one situation, an object that you had not used, that you had imparted no effort into, it's not available to you. I mean, you have not used it, and my actions have changed nothing. It's just the potential for you to use it is now gone. At least your potential to use it in its natural form. In the other, in the taxation case, I have already expended effort, and I already have an expectation of use, and you're expropriating that. Those are not equivalent. And the other utilitarian argument, just to make it, not to say that it's in and of itself persuasive, is that when people create goods, when they take nature and they expropriate nature to themselves to create things. They consume what they create, but any excess production, they will any unconsumed surplus, they will make available to other people. And so the idea that if somebody has made property for themselves, then that means that resources have been denied me is, in effect, it could be true, but in effect, not only is untrue, but it's almost the opposite, because the person who has created the property is almost certainly going to convert it into actual consumer goods as opposed to raw materials. So instead of a vacant plot of land that is not ready for human consumption, the original acquirer of the property will convert it into, say, a farm. And not only are you denied use, you're not denied use of the land, you now have access to farm products, or if it's a mine, whatever it is they mine, or whatever goods they produce. And so there isn't, it's not like part of the earth has been cut off from you. In practice, the earth has been made more productive, and at no cost to you, at no effort on you didn't have to spend any money for it. You didn't have to put any of your labor. The original appropriator did all that. He took the risk of putting labor into something that might not have panned out, which happens quite a bit. He then consumes enough for himself, which in the past, mostly that's what people did. They would not have much unconsumed surplus, usually. But any that he would be made available conditionally. Some people get real kind of upset at the idea that people would offer exchanges only conditionally, but states do this as well. States never say you may have whatever you want unconditionally. The condition is you obey them and that you pay taxes. They offer services, so-called, I wouldn't say that's accurate, but they offer you things on the condition that you submit to them at the very least, and usually that you pay them. But yeah, a farmer or a guy who originally appropriates land is going to offer his unsold surpluses. He may offer them for free. He may be a nice guy, be charitable. That certainly happens, and not so rarely as to be what's the word? Negligible. Sorry about that. But typically they're going to ask for something else in return. But this is hardly evil, because if someone then doesn't like the terms of the exchange, say he's offering a bushel of barley and he wants a pound of cheese, and you don't think that's fair, then you don't give him the cheese. But if you do think it's fair and you make the exchange, then you're both demonstrably better off. You made an exchange that you wouldn't have done unless you had benefited. And so the people who go out and so-called deny use of natural land to some greater society are in fact improving the natural land and then offering the opportunity at no cost to third parties the ability to make mutually beneficial exchange. And this is, by the way, where society comes from. It does not come because an election or some political genius willed prosperity upon the world. Governments love to take credit for that, but their record of actually being able to do it is quite pathetic, actually. And that's even not counting all the destruction they wrought, that they cause, which is for some reason not taken into account by most people. So I will say this, though. A lot of libertarians, and I mentioned this in the other video, they believe in locking in, mixing in with your labor. I don't know explicitly about Rothbard. I love Rothbard, by the way. He's my favorite political philosopher and my second favorite economist after Mises. I think he did go a little bit too far, because they do say things that basically, if you create a piece of property, then it's yours forever. So, for instance, our farmer, he could make a farm and say he leaves. and never comes back, and then somebody else comes and starts to use the farm for something else. The really strong libertarian purists on property rights, some of them, not all of them, might claim that even generations later, his grandson might come back and kick off who's over there and say, this is actually my land because my grandfather originally appropriated it and he didn't actually agree to sell it to somebody. I believe that would be an accurate representation of, like, say, Rothbard's position. I don't agree with that, and I don't think that you can make, just as by thinking really hard or appealing to logical reason, I don't think you can make a system of either law or of property rights that is normative, that just is going to work. It has to come about organically through dispute resolution. It has to come about by people saying, like in the situation with the farm, say the grandson comes back and there are people basically that he considers squatters, but these people didn't even know that it had ever been his. So we have a dispute here, both two parties claiming the same land. What are they going to do? They're going to have to talk about it. Again, always with the possibility of fighting, but there's a strong disincentive to do that most of the time. Unless you have all the guns, which is another reason not to really like states very much. I've always heard parity of power promotes peaceful solutions. If you're going to vest all the martial ability in one institution within a society, that's basically asking for abuse. But the two disputing parties are going to have to work it out. Now, my guess is that socialists like to say use, and he references the rentier, the class that makes money off rent. There's nothing wrong with making money off rent. There is something wrong if you abandon your property for a long time and basically, well, think about it like this. The socialists, I think, go too far because they'll say you could be out working with an axe and set the axe down to wipe your bra, and they would take the axe and say you weren't using it. And I've actually seen real-life socialists actually go and steal people's vegetables from their gardens. And they say they weren't using them, they were just sitting in the ground. Literally, I've seen that. There's a documentary out there called On the Mesa. It's about a whole bunch of basically anarchists living out in the desert of New Mexico, actually. And some of the people who live out, a lot of them are like constitutionalists, kind of libertarians, and a lot of them are anarcho-socialists, anarcho-syndicalists. And the anarcho-syndicalists would actually go around robbing people. They'd take vegetables and they would say, and this is a place where they don't have like a Walmart. Like, people have to survive by growing stuff, and it's hard because it's a desert. And they would literally steal vegetables and say they weren't using them. That's going a little bit too far. I think it's not a bad idea, but it's taking it too literally. I think Locke had a great insight, and I think I would reciprocate that and say if you mix something with your labor, you are converting it to your use. But if you stop mixing your labor with it and it is returned back to nature, as that process happens, that's not something that's going to necessarily occur instantly or at one particular point. As it progresses back to a natural state, its status as your property similarly erodes. So I don't think that property is something that can be, one second it's yours, one second it's not, other than when you're voluntarily, explicitly doing that, that I see it as something that can erode away. And not that I speak Latin, but I actually went and found out a Latin term I think would be cool to describe this process: ex vis tergum ut vis, from nature back to nature. I'm a geek, I know. I'd be more of a geek if I could speak Latin, but ex vis tergum ut vis. And that's not to say that I'm prescribing that, okay, if your field is half overgrown, that you have half ownership in it. I'm just saying that sounds to me like what most people would think of as a reasonable basis for dispute, or to talk about, okay, I left for 20 years, I'm sorry, you've been living here for 10 years. Um, let's talk about this. And it'd be very easy for, say, the people who moved there to say, okay, we're not going to leave, but we understand that maybe you were thinking that you'd be able to come back, and so here we'll pay you something, or we'll give you part of it, or vice versa. But the norms of this are going to have to develop through a long series of disputes and resolutions to those disputes. The body of law, basically, of like common law, which is where our law comes from. At some point, the kings took over. If you look, I did a video, private law, public law, private profit. All the law codes for which I'm familiar, and I would wager probably all of them, were originally anarchist laws. They arose independent and outside of states, and states would just codify them at some point to their benefit. They'd start charging people to use them and everything. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about on this, but I don't think that there's an equivalency between taxation and private property. But I also don't think that property is something that can be just thought up by some intellectual. You do need norms, and I think these do require that you basically talk with other people, but that doesn't necessarily give some group say in the matter. It's a series of agreements with the people around you, with your neighbors, basically. They can be independent. We still do this. We think about it. We all have different property norms for the different social groups we're in. Like my car, for instance, I'll let my immediate family, they can drive it. If they say, hey, I need it, they have my keys, they can do it. My extended family, about half of them I wouldn't mind, but the other half I would say no. My coworkers, they can't touch my car. I'll give them a ride, they can't drive it. But my coworkers, I share an apartment. This is not where I live. This is where I live when I work, which is most of the time. We share a refrigerator, and I'm okay with them having some of my food, not some of my food, and they know what that is. But if a random person came in here, that would be a different rule. And so it's a series of understandings that we have that are either implicit or explicit, and implicit understandings can be valid too. If you ever have a dispute with an implicit understanding, it's a little bit more tricky than if you have an explicit understanding. Sorry, American Idol just became interesting. Did I hope I didn't just say that. Sorry. Talking about something important and I have to watch. Sorry. But I don't see how, if I have an agreement with my coworker or with each of my family members, how some third party is somehow accruing a debt through that process. Some group, especially a group that doesn't have definite bounds, that doesn't have a will. That to me is not proven for sure, and much harder to prove given the inexactness of groups. Man, did I just make a 40-minute video? Yeah, I'm totally sorry. If anyone watches this whole thing, make a comment at the end and be like, I actually watched the whole thing, and I will be totally impressed. It's just because I got off work and I just feel kind of like, I'm going to sit here and talk to YouTube about property rights because I'm new at it. So, ex vis, tergamut vis.